Our battle with the Eyrie seemed endless. Fighting desperately to halt their advance, casualties on both sides were catastrophic. Maria, my beloved, remember me as I was, aloof and distant. We were so focused on destroying the birds, we missed the threat right under our noses.
When will you learn? When will you learn that your actions have consequences?
They've been called unorthodox, inevitable, and insufferable. Starting from absolutely nothing, the Woodland Alliance aims to metastasize across the entire board, feeding from opponents who dare to oppose them. My name's Nevakanezah, and not only do I rarely play the Woodland Alliance, I also can no longer fit any of my Che Guevara shirts from high school. But, like any good anarcho-capitalist slumlord, I outsource the work to the two best Woodland Alliance players I know. Say hello to Mr. Lord of the Board and Waterman121, who both helped me write and deliver this script. Let's begin with the general game plan you want to follow as the Woodland Alliance. First, we want to set up our first base as soon as possible. This is going to give us card draw and removes the limit on our supporters. Second, we want to quickly cross key choke points on the map and avoid getting trapped by our opponents. Third, we want to establish our second base in a distant location with many connections, ideally sometime by turn 4. Fourth, we want to cross the 2-cost sympathy track as quickly as we possibly can. And fifth, we want to place as much of the high-value sympathy as we can, using supporters for the distant and cheap clearings, and warriors for the nearby and heavily defended clearings. In the opening stages of the game, you want to set up your first base by turn 2. Setting it up on turn 3 is rough. Setting it up on turn 4 is a loss. The ideal turn 1 ends with multiple sympathy in the middle of the board and enough supporters to revolt using any of the tokens that survive. 2 bird supporters is ideal for the start. A bird and 2 suited supporters is also pretty versatile. Having 2 sympathy that match a pair of suited supporters is also good. And if you absolutely must bank on a certain token surviving, then make sure it's in the least important spot out of all of them. If you have the room to do so, try placing bait sympathy on your opponents to drain their actions so you can revolt on a clearing that's still good. These can be locations with important buildings to your opponents, or locations that are so well connected your opponents simply can't allow you to be there. Another possibility for your starting revolt is the potential of gaining extra recruits by having matching sympathy on other clearings. This is also known as the Magic Christmas Land Revolt, because opponents revile anything that makes your life any easier and will do what they can to stop it. This specific possibility isn't worth targeting intentionally, but if the board grants you an opportunity to have multiple sympathy that match, take it. It's important to note that the Woodland Alliance is at their most vulnerable when they don't have a base on the board. Your card draw is at its lowest, you're capped at 5 supporters, and because you're forced to discard the newest supporter over that 5, it's possible to have a set of supporters that you cannot use to spread or revolt at all, effectively locking you out of the game permanently. This is why, in these starting turns, you should think of your starting hand as being entirely sacrificial. You need all of the supporters you can get early on. Mobilizing your entire hand is usually the right choice, regardless of what's in it. The early game is also the most reliable time to spread sympathy, as martial law and sympathy removal takes time. As well, virtually no cards in the entire game are worth holding onto from turn 1. Unless you really need a specific sympathy to survive in order to revolt, then this also includes ambushes. There are only 3 cards that might be an exception to this: Propaganda Bureau, Corvid Planners, and maybe Boat Builders, as these cards dramatically improve your ability to escape containment and place sympathy throughout the rest of the game. Everything else is expendable. Once you have your first base, remember to always keep it defended. 2 warriors is typically enough to keep opponents off your back until the late game, but well-armed opponents can overcome your defenders much faster than you'd think. Lastly, some opponents like the moles and badgers are capable of dangerously fast scoring, but vulnerable to card loss. Placing your starting sympathy over top of these opponents can be more than just worthwhile. It's often necessary. The bulk of Woodland Alliance decision-making comes from choosing where we position our resources. We want to avoid becoming isolated, which means having a widely distributed board presence instead of overcommitting to clearings where we might become trapped. The location of our first base should be determined by the following. Do I have the supporters to revolt? Does this location have a lot of adjacent clearings? Will the sympathy I need survive until next turn? Do my opponents have enough actions between them all to remove all the sympathies, or should I bully one player specifically? And if I revolt there, am I going to get immediately trapped? If we get stuck beside places like the Marquis Keep with only one other path out, we'll spend half the game or more struggling to fight our way out of this corner. It's tempting to revolt someplace where you'll remove cardboard, but those extra victory points are a distant secondary consideration compared to having a base that's well positioned to spread sympathy later on. When we place our second base, we want this one to be the main foothold we use to spread sympathy to the far side of the map. Having your bases 2 or more clearings apart is often good enough, you just don't want them adjacent to each other. And on every map, certain clearings are especially valuable to the Woodland Alliance, or especially damaging for your opponents to lose. Revolting on these clearings can be amazing, but it can be a major struggle to establish a foothold here in the face of dedicated opponents.
Your opponents are smart people. To them, our bright green little fist tokens inspire unadulterated loathing. In the race to become king of the forest, no one mourns the Woodland Alliance. So the main way to stop us is containment. If spreading sympathy is more expensive than removing it, the Alliance isn't going to be able to ease on down the sympathy track. Here's our top threats. Martial law from factions with lots of warriors. Token denial abilities like snares, the keep, and mobs. Choke points, where there's only one clearing we can spread to. And battle-heavy factions that don't mind losing cards in exchange for our cardboard VP. So the worst situation is to be stuck with only one place to expand to, because opponents can easily trap us inside our base, destroying our scoring curve like a comet pulled from orbit. We avoid this situation by either dancing through life, sneaking across those key choke points before they're closed off, saying, "You're never gonna bring me down," and defending sympathy in the choke with a warrior. Sitting in your castle and stocking up enough supporters to burst through their defensive line and establish a foothold. These options are ordered by increasing cost and risk. Now, these things must be done delicately. Conventional Woodland doctrine says, the Woodland Alliance should not exceed 20 points until the turn where they win. This is sensible. Players will often avoid dealing directly with the Alliance until they're an immediate threat to win. So flying under the radar lets you prepare your burst turn without the board sending a party of protagonists to steal your broom. But once again, stocking up on all those supporters makes losing a base extra painful. Now if you do push past 20 VP, aim to be within 2 VP of winning. That way, even if someone drops a house on you, you can still likely scrounge up 2 points some way, somehow. Take a look at the location of your starting base. For your future to remain unlimited, you'll need to plan ahead as to which choke points represent the greatest threat to your expansion. And if your sympathy can survive for a full round on the far side of that choke point, then congratulations, you now have a foothold. Opponents with brains are going to know how to park a bunch of warriors on our bases to challenge us for rule and keep our warriors stuck at home. This is a problem. If we can't leave our base, then we can't organize or reinforce sympathy in the choke points. In order to leave our base, we'll most likely have to use valuable evening actions to battle. Our warriors are very costly to replace, and ambushes can straight up knock us out for a full round. So don't get liquidated by the opposition. Get across those chokes early and stack those supporters, and you'll be off to win the endgame.
In the mid-game, our objectives are to spread as far across the map as fast as we can, to establish our second base in a well-connected location by turn 4 or 5, to do everything we can to place all of our 2-cost sympathy in as few turns as possible, and to avoid, at all costs, getting put in jail. Our starting area will naturally end up having a lot of sympathy, but to win the game we need sympathy on nearly every clearing on the board. Whenever you can, try to spread far away, rather than taking up the easier clearings right next door. You generally only need 2 bases for the majority of Woodland Alliance games. Because we have to split our very limited warrior pool between actions and defenders, it's not really worthwhile to commit over half your supply towards defending 3 bases at once. As you spread your sympathy in the mid-game, consider how it controls the board state a lot more than people often talk about. Your opponent's willingness to avoid or target your sympathy is going to have a large impact on which spaces of the board they prioritize. Use this to your advantage to draw opponents towards each other or keep them penned in by taking up space they need. Next, we need to discuss the 2-cost section of the sympathy track. The 2-cost track is where our costs are the highest relative to our scoring. If opponents have martial law in every clearing, then we're spending 3 supporters for just 1 or 2 victory points each time. Even if they both moved and battled to remove each token, we would still be spending 3 supporters for every 2 our opponents give us. When our opponents are focused on trying to contain us, they're going to keep us in the 2-cost sympathy track as much as possible. Even with martial law, the 1-cost track is very easy for us to replace. The 3-cost sympathy track, however, is very expensive to place, but it's where the majority of our victory points are found. We want to be placing tokens from this part of the track, because we score a ton of points for doing so. But if we can engineer a situation where we bridge the 2-cost sympathy track in a single turn, it helps us avoid situations where we're stuck overspending for too long. As well, placing tokens in bursts increases the number of targets opponents need to suddenly worry about if they want to keep containing you, making it harder to push you back to where you started. In order to successfully cross this track as fast as possible, we'll need to stock up on supporters so we can spread all at once. We need to defend our bases even harder as they'll become targets once we have many supporters. We have to plan how to use our evening actions to help place as much sympathy as possible, possibly positioning those warriors in advance. We also have to think carefully about our expansion path, and which clearings will be both the cheapest and ones that our opponents will be least interested in removing us from. We want to use our supporters to spread far away through chains of low-cost clearings. We want to use these evening actions to spread to nearby clearings with martial law in them, and the more sympathy an opponent has to remove by themselves to keep you contained, the less likely they are to do it. Now, if you happen to be a fan of fighting games, you'll know that some characters are known for being very difficult to handle so long as their player keeps pressing buttons. These characters are sometimes lovingly referred to as Unga. In many ways, the Woodland Alliance is the Unga faction of Root. The general idea here is that the Woodland Alliance does not have as much tense decision-making to do as some other factions might. You churn through your engine and try to avoid fucking yourself over. Opponents are capable of overcoming you, but it requires a lot of caution and gameplay knowledge. And in spite of being Unga, knowing when to actually police instead of just doing Woodland Alliance things is important. And it's also important to know that you have a few key bad matchups. Your best matchups are opponents that have few actions and hate outrage because it screws with their hand. Your worst matchups are factions who love having tons of free victory points around, have a ton of actions, and don't care at all about cards. More specifically, crows love having someone to hide behind, and are quite adept at making your life more difficult. Playing around them by outracing them or letting the crows take the heat is easy, and you shouldn't be afraid to wager your cards on exposure. Snares and bombs can be quite a threat to the Woodland Alliance, but the former often get removed by players looking to move around, and the latter is often a safe guess whenever plot tokens are on top of one of our bases. When you're playing with the lizards, Woodland Alliance and lizards do an amazing job of ruining each other's lives, and it's rarely worth it for either of them. You can destroy gardens with sympathy that they struggle to remove, and they can convert bases to gain rule that you can't overcome. Consider making deals with the lizards to avoid an eternal war. For those of you with the Marauder expansion, the Warlord is potentially one of the worst matchups for Woodland Alliance in the entire game. The Warlord doesn't care about losing cards. He loves extra cardboard VP, can deal extra hits to take out your bases, and has tons of battles. And as well, his mob tokens let him remove cardboard every turn, costing him only 1 action. Mob tokens can be a nightmare when it comes to keeping you in prison. Where martial law can make it expensive to establish a new foothold, you might just find yourself spending those supporters only for mob tokens to effortlessly erase them. Plus, it's far harder for you to remove the mobs than it is for the Warlord to put them back. Playing around the Warlord means avoiding him as much as you can, and having fallback positions when you finally do move into his space. Struggling to establish a foothold in Warlord territory sucks, but getting surrounded by mob tokens on turn 1 is far, far worse. For your better matchups, the Moles and Keepers in Iron can be tough opponents to outrace, but they're dreadfully protective of their cards. These two factions are prime candidates to surround with Sympathy on turn 1, as the loss of cards will dampen their burst potential to something more manageable. Placing Sympathy on the mole burrow at the start of the game is often well worthwhile, as they'll often be very reluctant to remove more than one Sympathy token, leaving your others free for a revolt. The Eerie Despot, however, is a similar threat level to the Warlord, but can be less frustrating to play against. By gaining extra victory points from every simp removed on top of the roost points, the Despot very rapidly races ahead of the table if they're allowed to farm Sympathy unopposed. Playing against this faction leader means keeping your tokens far away from them for as long as you can, especially if they have battle actions in their decree. Now for some small optimizations you can use in any game. First, if you suspect you're about to lose a base, protect matching cards in your hand so you can mobilize them later. Or spend the supporters that we get discarded if your base goes away. If opponents have removed all your warriors in an attempt to destroy your base, consider removing the base before the Sympathy token that's beside it. By removing the base first, you take your losses while still having a Sympathy token left over that can generate you outrage. As well, if they leave it on the board, you can use that Sympathy token to potentially revolt in the next turn or two. One of the strange things about losing a base is that it can really suck, or it can be completely irrelevant. You can use this to your advantage if you have time to prepare by letting people destroy bases you don't care about. Losing a base sucks most when your entire supporter stack matches your base and you're about to lose a pile of officers that you aren't going to be able to train back immediately. Losing a base is irrelevant if your supporter stack doesn't match at all, you can revolt again next turn, or you've got a ton of cards in hand to replace the officers. It can be worthwhile to abandon a base if opponents are using it to keep you in jail. Being too attached can be a weakness that loses you several turns where replacing a base might only cost you one. If you don't have any more bases on the board, consider mobilizing your cards such that you don't lose outrage cards due to the 5 supporter limit. If opponents trigger outrage when you have no bases on the board and you already have 5 supporters, all those extra cards are just going to waste. If you know someone is likely to trigger outrage, don't fill your supporter stack immediately.
Our warriors are the lifeblood of Woodland Alliance strategy. Not only are they vital to get use out of guerrilla warfare, but they're the one area where we have complete agency to solve issues created by our opponents or maybe bad RNG. Now, we need to divide our scant 10 warriors between the 4 through 6 defenders we need to protect our bases, the 4 through 5 officers that we want for actions, and the 1 through 2 defenders we want to protect key Sympathy tokens, and the 1 hanging warrior that we'll be using to organize wherever needed. It takes more time than you'd think to build up officers, since we also need those cards to mobilize and revolt. Now, unless you need the card to break through a choke point, it's better to train an officer than to mobilize. Now, just a quick segue, buying from the otters is going to be a really bad idea. Do not do it. The reason for this is because you only have 10 warriors in your supply pool, and if you are buying from the otters, you are going to be heavily limiting your options for the other areas where you really need your warriors to be, like defending your bases, officers for your actions, and of course, protecting your Sympathy tokens like we were saying before. Now, remember that revolt will take 2 or more warriors from your supply, 1 officer, and then 1 or more defenders. This matters if your plans demand having a warrior to recruit, or if you have Propaganda Bureau, for example. Now, the rough rule of thumb is that we want to have 4 through 5 officers by the end of the game, but this will vary widely depending on the game. Now, instead, it is more valuable to understand the priorities that we're trying to balance. The most valuable use for our warriors is sending them into the clearings with martial law so that they can organize, gaining a Sympathy without costing supporters. Organizing allows us to place far more Sympathy than supporters would alone, especially in the 3 cost track, and allows us to choose the Sympathy that we actually place. Now, second most valuable job for our warriors is defending bases. Our guerrilla warfare ability is incredible. It is one of the best abilities in the game, but it is absolutely useless if your buildings are not defended. Remember that the average battle will roll a 2 through a 1, so each defender that you place will typically cost a full battle action for your opponents to remove. Now, we have to commit our warriors to becoming officers in order to take actions, because we need to both move and organize in order to place Sympathy. Officers are most valuable to us in pairs, with 1 additional officer left to replace the warriors we organize. This is why 5 warriors is often the preferred target number, because it's the lowest number that allows you to organize twice while still being able to avoid leaving your base completely defenseless. Ideally, we only want warriors to remain on the map if they're defending a base, or if they can be organized into Sympathy next turn. We don't want to be fighting for rule on any more clearings than we absolutely need to, and every warrior that's trapped somewhere that cannot organize is a warrior that we can no longer use. We want our warriors in the supply, where they can be recruited onto bases to replace the ones that we just organized. Corvid Planners and Propaganda Bureau are game-winning cards for us. The former means that our warriors can reach clearings that aren't simply adjacent to our bases in order to organize, and the latter not only weakens opponents, but allows us to organize Sympathy anywhere on the map for the cost of 1 card each turn. Pair these with a Saboteurs because opponents will recognize how strong these cards are for us. Just remember that Propaganda Bureau's useless if you do not start your turn with a spare warrior that you can place. Conversely, Coffin Makers can be the bane of our existence because it prevents our organized warriors from immediately returning to the supply. Oh, you wanted to organize a few warriors and then recruit them back to your base? Too bad, because your supply is now as empty as your base and you've helped feed points to one of your opponents. By limiting our warrior supply, this card dramatically reduces our effectiveness, so it's worth saving a Saboteur for. Now, let's talk quickly about guarding Sympathy, when to do it, and why. Well, if an opponent has you in jail, for example, guard the Sympathy that you need to break out of it. And if an opponent is feeding on Sympathy victory points too much, guard a couple of them to make it less valuable. Positioning a bunch of warriors on one turn so that you can organize them all on the next for big scoring.
At last we arrive at the end game. The ideal Woodland Alliance endgame happens when we finally hit 15 to 20 victory points. We have a bunch of supporters and a lot of organizing queued up that'll place a ton of 3-cost Sympathy for us in order to burst ahead of our opponents. Now, in most cases, those supporters are just going to get us into the door of that sweet, sweet extra premium DLC 3-cost Sympathy. And we're going to rely on our warriors to do the rest because that shit is expensive. The very beginning of this endgame phase is right about when opponents will start looking really hard at destroying your bases or coordinating to remove Sympathy in a way that's going to prevent you from winning. That means that defending is going to be even more important than ever here. When it comes to your opponents, however, there's a few major paths they're going to pursue to try and stymie your win. The first is that you have a bunch of actions or supporters saved up to burst, and they manage to destroy one of your bases, which is going to cost you all those supporters and officers. The second is that you just finished your burst, and you need 1 or 2 more high-value Sympathy to win, but they remove virtually all of your Sympathy from the board, making it extremely difficult to score more than a couple points on your next turn. And thirdly, you are a hair's breadth from winning, but they clear a whole bunch of matching Sympathy before removing those specific bases, costing you your supporters, officers, and place Sympathy. No matter which one of these options your opponents choose, it's going to be a very major investment from them in order to actually achieve what they're going for. This means they're only going to consider it if you are the biggest threat at the table and they have no other options. It is for this reason that the best way to avoid getting shut down like this is often to stay under the radar until your burst phase is going to take you within 1 to 3 points of victory, where even a pair of 1-cost Sympathy and an item craft will win you the game immediately. The alternative, of course, is hoping that you have God and anime on your side, and your scant few warriors are going to defend your bases while opponents remove all of the Sympathy. One important side effect of staying under the radar like this is that in the current, very aggressive Marauder meta, your opponents typically will reach an endgame where they now have to eradicate each other to prevent someone from winning. If you've managed to stay off their radar until all life on Earth has been eradicated, then your Sympathy tokens can start returning to the empty streets and villages they left behind. Nature is healing. Even in very competitive games, this tends to happen, because opponents will try to keep you in jail, and someone needs to get killed eventually, and then, when the fighting actually starts, you're typically too expensive for people to focus on if they don't want to get destroyed by someone else. Not every endgame is going to be this straightforward, however, and oftentimes you're going to find yourself in a position where you can win if you manage to complete enough calculus to figure out how you can get to 30 points. While I could try and thoroughly explain all the board positions and possibilities you should be considering here, this is already the longest video I've ever created, and why would I do the work when the good Sir Waterman121 has already done enough for me? His channel will be linked in the description, where you can go to find a whole bunch of examples of endgame Woodland Alliance puzzle scenarios to practice your toast distribution strategies and master the art of pulling a win out of your ass. In fact, while you're at it, go check out Lord of the Boards channel as well. He created some of the original strategy guides for Root, and he has several gameplay videos that are both entertaining and informative. And that's the video. Thank you all for watching. Remember to hit all that algorithm bullshit, and be good to each other. I'll see you all next time.